17 million Americans claim Italian ancestry. It runs through the neighborhoods of New York and Boston and Philadelphia, through family names and Sunday dinners, and the cultural memory of the Great Migration that brought millions of Italians across the Atlantic between 1880 and 1920. And underneath that ancestry sits the most famous civilization of the ancient world, Rome, the empire that built roads still in use today, whose language became the foundation of half of Europe's tongues, and whose history is taught in every school. But the question of who the Romans actually were, genetically, had never been answered until very recently. And when the ancient DNA finally answered it, the result overturned almost everything that had been assumed. Because the people who founded Rome and the people who ruled its empire at its height were, genetically, almost entirely different populations. The city of Rome did not simply grow, it was repeatedly transformed, its genetic makeup rewritten again and again by the very success that made it the center of the ancient world. In 2019, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Science that analyzed the ancient DNA of more than 120 individuals buried in and around Rome, spanning a period of 12,000 years from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived in the region before farming, through the founding of the city, the Republic, the Empire, and into the medieval period. It was the most detailed genetic portrait of a single city ever assembled, drawing on remains from 29 archaeological sites across the Roman region. And it revealed a population in constant, dramatic flux, a city whose genetic identity never settled, never stabilized, but kept being remade by each new chapter of its history. The earliest inhabitants of the Italian peninsula followed the pattern seen across Europe: hunter-gatherers, then Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, then a significant infusion of steppe ancestry during the Bronze Age, the same Yamnaya-derived migration that transformed the rest of the continent. By the time Rome was founded, traditionally dated to 753 BC, the population of central Italy carried this mixture. These were the Romans of legend, the Rome of the kings, the early Republic, the Rome that fought Carthage and conquered Italy. Genetically, they resembled other populations of the central Mediterranean. These were the Romans of the founding myths, of Romulus and Remus, of the kings, of the stern Republic that prided itself on simplicity and discipline. Genetically, they were a central Italian people rooted in the peninsula. Then Rome conquered the world, and the world came to Rome. As the Republic expanded into an empire stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf, the genetic makeup of the city itself began to change with extraordinary speed. The ancient DNA from the imperial period, the Rome of the Caesars, the Rome of 1 million inhabitants, the largest city the world had yet seen, shows a population that had shifted dramatically toward the eastern Mediterranean. The Romans of the empire carried ancestry from the Near East, from the Levant, from Greece and Anatolia and the eastern provinces. The genetic center of gravity of the city moved eastward, toward the populations of the lands Rome had conquered and connected. Among the individuals from this period, the researchers found people whose recent ancestry traced to North Africa, to the Near East, to Central Europe, and to the Eastern Mediterranean, sometimes within the same cemetery, sometimes within what appear to have been the same families. The cosmopolitan reality of imperial Rome that historians had read about in the written sources, a city where dozens of languages were spoken in the streets and people from every corner of the known world lived side by side, was now visible directly in the DNA of the people buried there. This was not a small shift. The study found that during the imperial period, the population of Rome became genetically almost indistinguishable from the populations of the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Greek and Near Eastern world. The descendants of the people who had founded the city were genetically swamped by the vast movement of people that the empire enabled. Slaves brought from the eastern provinces, soldiers, merchants, administrators, and migrants drawn to the largest city in the world came in numbers large enough to reshape the genetic identity of Rome itself within a few centuries. The mechanism was the empire's own success. Rome connected the entire Mediterranean basin into a single political and economic unit, with the city at its center. People flowed toward that center from every direction, but disproportionately from the densely populated, urbanized eastern provinces, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt. The slave trade moved hundreds of thousands of people, many from the east, into Italy. And unlike many slave systems in history, the Roman system frequently freed slaves who then became citizens and had children who were fully Roman. The genetic consequence was a population that, at the height of the empire, carried more Eastern Mediterranean ancestry than Italian. Then the empire fell, and the genetic tide reversed. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, the ancient DNA shows the population of Rome shifting again, this time back toward European ancestry, with the arrival of Germanic and other northern European peoples during the period of the barbarian invasions and the early Middle Ages. The Eastern Mediterranean signal that had dominated the imperial period receded. The population that emerged in medieval Rome was different again from both the founders and the imperial inhabitants, a new mixture reflecting the new political reality of a fragmented post-imperial Italy. What this means is that there is no single ancient Roman population. The Romans were a moving target, a genetic identity that was reshaped repeatedly by the historical forces the city itself unleashed. The Rome of Romulus, the Rome of Augustus, and the Rome of the medieval popes were three genetically distinct populations occupying the same 7 hills across 1,000 years. The continuity was cultural and political. It was the language, the institutions, the law, the idea of Rome itself, not genetics. The blood changed completely while the name stayed the same. This is perhaps the most important lesson ancient DNA has to teach about how civilizations actually work. Rome was not a bloodline. It was an idea that successive, genetically different populations inherited, carried, and passed on. A Roman was not a person of a particular ancestry. A Roman was anyone who became part of the project. For the 17 million Americans who claim Italian ancestry, this history is directly relevant. Modern Italians, including the Southern Italians who made up the bulk of the migration to America, carry the genetic legacy of all of these waves: the Neolithic farmers, the steppe migrants, the Eastern Mediterranean infusion of the imperial period, and the later Northern European arrivals. Southern Italy in particular retains significant Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, a legacy of Greek colonization that predated Rome and the connections that the empire deepened. The Italian-American identity, which feels so specific and so rooted, rests on one of the most genetically layered populations in Europe. The ancient DNA from Rome tells a story that is, in a sense, the opposite of the replacement narratives found in Britain and Ireland and Germany. Rome was not transformed by a single migration that overwhelmed the existing population. It was transformed continuously by the constant churn of people that its own imperial success generated. The city was a genetic vortex, pulling in populations from across 3 continents and blending them into something that changed with every century. The Romans conquered the world and brought it home, and in doing so they rewrote themselves again and again until the people who ruled the empire bore little genetic resemblance to the people who had founded the city that created it. Rome was never one people. It was the place where all the peoples of the ancient world eventually came together, and the DNA in the graves remembers every one of them. If you want more history that DNA is rewriting, subscribe to The Lost Blueprint. New discoveries every day.